So if we worked our way through this chapter, we've talked about variability, how important it is, and how populations can evolve without them. And as I mentioned the other day in class, we've talked about how what selection does is basically select positively, right? Select those variabilities that have that advantageous variation, those that leave behind more offspring. So if you do a little extrapolation, you would assume probably that through time there will be less variation, right? Assuming the environment stays relatively stable, which it doesn't, but assuming in a particular place that it does, say for hundreds of thousands of years, you would expect that the organisms there would have very little variability, and yet they do. And that's what I was talking about, or began to talk about, in this idea of balancing selection. Where do we, how do we balance out the idea of finding the best variance, and how do we keep enough variability around to account for the fact that the environment's going to change in the future, and we don't know how it's going to happen? And one of the ways that happens, remember, among those organisms that are diploid, is something known as heterozygote advantage. And I explained that to you the other day in class, where the individuals who have the trait for sickle cell anemia, the full-blown homozygous recessive trait that's going to result in the complete manifestation of the disease, they're not going to live as long. That means they're not going to have as many offspring, and many of their offspring are probably going to be at least carriers, right? At least carriers, if not, depending on who they mate with, if not completely have the disease themselves. Those individuals without sickle cell anemia, without even the trait, right, with the homozygous dominant, right, we're not going to suffer from sickle cell anemia, but they are going to suffer from the disease malaria. Malaria, which is a blood parasite brought by the mosquito. And so what we do when we put a map of the incidences of sickle cell anemia across an area of the world in which we find high rates of that in sub-Saharan or tropical Africa, we see there's an interesting little detective work that was done, because the hatched lines are where you find the blood parasite. Now, where you find the mosquito, that name there is Plasmodium. That's the parasite that's in the red blood cell that you see on the left, little purple thing. But there's an overlap between those. And the reason why that is through time, what was selected for were individuals who were heterozygotes, who neither had the full-blown sickle cell anemia condition. As I mentioned in class, they do sometimes get some of that, but they didn't have the full-blown. And they didn't have to worry about malaria because of having sickle cell anemia trait or being sickle celled. It's more difficult for mosquitoes or for the parasite, the protozoan parasite there, to get into the red blood cells. Now, it's the same for those with sickle cell anemia and those with the trait, but you do the numbers game again, right? So if you don't have sickle cell anemia at all, you're going to live a period of time but die young, leave behind relatively few offspring, relatively because of the malaria parasite. If you have sickle cell anemia, you got that going on. But if you're heterozygote, right? If you're heterozygote, then you have the advantage of being somewhat resistant to malaria and somewhat resistant to sickle cell anemia, right? And all you got to be in evolution is just better than just, you don't have to be the best, right? Just to be better than everybody around you. So that means that what we do when we're diploid, for those that are, not all critters are, mentioned like mosses, for example, spend a lot of their life being haploid, and they take care of this variability problem a different way, which we'll talk about. But if you're diploid, you can hide that genetic information in a recessive allele, and it might become something very important later on. This explains, too, why we fast forward to today and we find higher rates of this disease in individuals who more recently came out of this part of the world, right? Folks who immigrated from this part of the world. Because of the fact that in that part of the world you would expect higher rates of sickle cell anemia, at least the trait, because it'd be selected for, right? This one was easy enough. We actually saw this in lab. This basically says frequency-dependent selection. This occurs when whatever's in the... This is a cool thing. There are fish out there that are called scale eaters. They actually make their living off parasitizing other fish, swimming up to them and biting off their scales. And because that's, you have to sort of twist your mouth and able to do that throughout time and evolution and this really cool thing, Mother Nature has caused these fish mouths to twist to one side or the left. And among these species of fish that do this, there are the left mouth versions and the right mouth versions. Okay? And you're born one way or the other. It's like being left-handed or right-handed, basically. And if you look at the graph down below, what you see in the red line is the frequency of the left-mouthed individuals, and what you see in the green is the amount of right mouth individuals that are reproducing. So if you connected the green dots and you connected the red dots, what you would find is you would actually see this cyclic pattern that occurring. So that as the frequency of the left mouth individuals increases, the next following years it begins to go down. Then it goes back up again. And then it goes down. And then it goes back up again. And the same's happening to the left mouth. That's the green dots if you connected them. Here's what's happening. It's like frequency dependent. If that fish in the middle is surrounded by scale eaters who are mostly of the right-mouthed variety, that fish in the middle will defend itself more to the left, to its left. If, on the other hand, it's the left-mouthed, then the fish is going to defend itself more to the right. Whatever side gets defended towards the most is the one that's going to be selected against, if you let me use that word, but you understand what's really happening is the side that the fish isn't defending towards, like if it's twisting to the right to catch the left-mouthed individuals more, the right-mouthed individuals have a selected advantage. All right? So frequency-dependent selection very often works, and predator-prey relationships work like this too. Prey populations go up, predator populations go up. You start killing off more of the prey populations fall, predator populations fall, and they do that up and down. Okay, sexual selection. Last few slides here. Sexual selection. Charles Darwin described a type of selection that he put outside of natural selection, although they kind of fit together. He didn't actually use the word, he used natural selection. He didn't use the word evolution. But sexual selection. Now remember in the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, if sexes are selecting, it will mess up your genetic equilibrium numbers. And if you're thinking, well, sexual selection occurs, it does, and it is part of evolution. But the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium says that the values will only change, the genotypic values will only change based on environmental pressure outside of sexual selection if sexual selection is not occurring, if it's random mating. In many species, it's not. So we have two types. We have those sexual selection that occurs between members of a sex fighting for another sex, males usually competing for the females. That's why we see like big horns on these big horned sheep, because they use the males to battle against each other. This is called intrasexual. Interesting thing about those big-horned sheep, we often wonder sometimes why evolution, if it's supposed to help an organism, seems to harm it. The picture on the right is an old picture of a fellow standing in front of an extinct elkish type critter. I don't know exactly what type it was, but you see the horns there have gotten really, really big, haven't they? If the males are going to be selected for, if the males are doing competing for females, then Mother Nature would select, natural selection would, for those males with big, strong horns, among other things, right? Big body, big neck, that kind of stuff. Sometimes Mother Nature goes a little bit too far, okay, and those horns get so heavy that they become a deterrent. They actually begin to hold the weight of the animal's head down, and the animal can't pick its head up very well, can't see what's coming after it. We believe, among other things, including habitat destruction, these heavy horns might have led to this creature's demise. So evolution is not perfect, is it? Right? Some evolution goes too far. There's an example of it. If the other way, where a sex selects one sex selects another, this is the one we're most familiar with. There's the cute little cardinals down on the right-hand side, and those are bluehead wrasses. That's a female up above, or a juvenile male, right? That's a female. And then juvenile males grow into, well, they look a little bit like the female until they become a super male. The one down below is a male, same species, but he's got a harem. A lot of fish do this. One sex chooses another in intersexual, and in many cases the color is important for this, right? The color. That's why the cardinals are the color they are, and that's why that super male bluehead wrasse down below, name is pretty obvious, right? Is very colorful, whereas the female and the juvenile males are the ones who aren't super males, kind of look sort of indescript. Now, does that mean that male gets picked off more by other fish? Yeah, probably, but he's a super male, remember? He's learned to stay alive. That's why he's super. So color is important in intersexual. Among killer whales, I found out that, there we go. This is some data I collected from killer whales at SeaWorld. Along the bottom, on the x-axis, is how long they are, and on the y is how tall their dorsal fins become. We've all seen the pictures, the posters and stuff of killer whales in a group in a pod. Like you see. Here's an interesting story. These frogs here, frogs do it on call, right? Male calls typically call, and you've heard them if you live in Florida. If you spend one night here, you've heard frogs. And the stronger, the more male, the more sexy the call, the more females you get, where they're, so that's how it works. Bats in this area, I believe this is Costa Rica, bats in this area have learned something about those frogs with the strongest, biggest calls. Just like the females of that species of Tungara frog, here's that big, strong, throaty call. That must be a big, strong male. That bat says, that's a big chunk of something to eat. So what the frogs have learned to do is the males will call and then move just a little bit. Like you can see those leaves over on the right, I believe. Maybe he would move and kind of hide underneath the leaf, waiting for the female to come close and then signal her over. So now it becomes call, move, call, move. You don't want to stay in the same place, right? So in this case, being the loudest or being the sexiest among frogs might get you eaten. So that's not a good thing, is it? It's a balance, right? It's a balance. As the frogs have learned to call and move, the bats have learned to adapt as well, hopefully, or they go extinct. All right, the perfect critter. You're never going to get that in evolution. Why not? For one thing, you can't start all over again. Evolution is limited by the past. Where you got to. And I use the human knee, and I hope I'm not engineering, I'm not an engineer, but I hope I'm not mistaking engineers. From what I understand, our knees and our backs are problematic for us as humans because of our bipedal locomotion. And while evolution has, selected for those variants to do best at that we still are kind of dealing with the fact that we kind of came out of a tetrapod origination, four-legged critters, right? Before we got up on our hind legs. So you can't fix something after it's further down the road. You can only kind of work with what you got. You can't go back to the beginning and say we should do knees this way. It'd be a lot better for them primates when they come along. Adaptations are compromises, right? Compromises. You give a little. You don't get everything you want. Even organisms that are out there competing in the environment, even if you say, well, that organism is clearly the most fit, it gets 90% of the resources. Doesn't get 100, right? Doesn't get 100. Sometimes it does. And compromises, of course, you never get perfection from compromises because compromise is only, well, by definition, you can't have perfection if there's a compromise because somebody doesn't have perfection, neither one of you, or however many is in the group there, right? Evolution is not always adaptive. There's things like the founder effect and genetic drift and the bottleneck, but they all kind of sum down to the same thing. They're not the best. They're not the fittest, right? Maybe that's a better word. I should change that to the fittest. But they may just be the luckiest. And lucky is evolution, right? But lucky is not natural selection. And that's why evolution is not always adaptive. That's an important part of that sentence. Adaptive changes are only occur through natural selection. And, of course, you can't have Lamarckism. Selection can only work on existing variations. You can't, alleles or changes or variants don't arise on demand. I wish I had a longer neck, and if I did, or if Lamarck would say if that were the case, then I could somehow change my genes so I could pass it on to my offspring, and they'd have longer necks, right? We know that's not the case. But you're never going to get the perfect critter in evolution. And even if you do, what's going to happen? Mother Nature's going to change all the rules and deal a new set of cards and change the environment. Just ask the dinosaurs. They know. All right, that's it for that chapter.